Okay, thank you for that, Paul. I was at a conference in Japan last year, and I was sat next to a couple of Germans who were talking about this particular talk, and they went, "This is a ridiculous title. Of course it's not naturally occurring." And I was just let the conversation roll, and I leant over and said, "Actually, that's my talk. It is ridiculous, but it's an issue that has to be addressed." And that was the purpose of us conducting this work around various places in Australia. And I'm going to talk about Mount Isa and Broken Hill as examples. But this issue of contamination in those communities being naturally occurring has been a great and significant barrier to actually undertaking remediation in those locations. And it's important that you break that myth so that the evidence is there that the correct process and addressing of the contamination issues and sources can be dealt with. So that's the context. There's an article on this, and it's available. I did it with my former PhD student who's now working at University of California, San Diego, Louise Christensen. She's been a co-author with myself and Paul and a few others. And that's available. And Paul's got a copy that he can circulate to anybody who wants the full version. I always start my talks like this to say thank you to all of my students who have really made me who I am and helped me gather the knowledge that I've got and helped me undertake all of the research. And we've done work in many places across Australia, and it's without doubt those students have been completely critical. So anybody here who's taught in the university or teaches in the university, they'll be aware that students really are the engine room. You might have some ideas, but they made these ideas happen. So we've undertaken a great amount of work, and I just acknowledge my students and also my colleagues. So one of the main issues to dealing with contamination in all situations is overcoming barriers. Sinclair beautifully epitomised this in 1935. He said, this was in King Cole, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." And you will see what that means as we move through this talk. So one of the issues is no data, no problem. And that's a classic situation. And you've got to get some data to overcome the initial problem. And that's often it's not the right data, or you're accused of not producing the right data, or the data's not being collected in the right way, or it's being misinterpreted. There's a whole range of reasons why the data that's produced may not be adequate, and I'll cover some of those. So the first thing that happens typically when you find that's contamination, the initial response is you get denials. Typically there's not a problem. Industry, government, captured scientists will downplay that, and I can produce reports about some of the work that we've done in Mount Isa and Port Pirie and Townsville that cover each of these various organisations where there's been almost a constructed truth around, no, it's not a problem, that's not correct, it's done the wrong method, or they use the wrong non-standard method and all that sort of stuff. However, typically what happens is you get that up front, and then behind the scenes the process of actually finding a way to deal with it, because they realise that most of the knowledge in the articles, it might not be done to their satisfaction, it's factual, and it must be dealt with. Classic 4 lines of defence that you typically get from industry are: 1, our activities do not pollute, our activities cause pollution, and if but they did not affect you. Our activities pollute the environment, but you weren't hurt. And 4, our activities pollute and hurt you, but it was not our fault. And these are rolled out in sequence over time. And finally, if all else fails, you work for the company, you caused the pollution. So, I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but there are really good examples of this in the literature in regard to some mining and smelting communities. Overcoming the barriers requires that you collect the evidence, the right evidence, in order to address the problem of contamination. This usually involves obviously a range of people. It could be community, it could be NGOs, it could be scientists. NGOs often employ scientists, independent scientists, or university scientists to do the work because they're concerned. And we did something like this up in Townsville, where we looked at lead, arsenic, cadmium emissions and nickel emissions coming from the port, where they were bringing in nickel and exporting lead and zinc ore on the ships. You find the data that helps implement change, gets taken on board by industry, government, policies adjusted, legislation's changed, licenses are altered, and then there's new management practices. There are examples of all this happening. Once the data is accepted, okay, we accept it, then the change happens, and then there's still a role for the scientists, keeping the bastards honest by assessing what's going on afterwards, are they doing what they're meant to be doing, and you can do nice follow-up studies. And we've done some of that sort of work in Port Pirie, where they did some cleanup, and we went to ascertain whether the cleanup was successful or not. So what is the miner's myth? This is a series of arguments to downplay the source and cause of contamination. And we've had these arguments put to us before when we've fronted up with information about contamination. The first and most favourite one, and the most common one, and you'll see it used in all sorts of ways. It was used in regard to, in a different way, to mercury down at the Orica site. The owners of the Orica originally said in a newspaper article, it must be thermometers. People must have been breaking thermometers in the kitchen. But it's just another way of saying it's not us, it's something else. It's naturally occurring, or it's from other source. Or the contamination is from legacy emissions. That's code for we can carry on polluting because our pollution is not causing the problem. The lead is bound up in glassy slag, and I see before me Mr. Adam Gilligan from the EPA. He would know that phrase, and that was used up at Bullaroo by Pasminco to say that the slag that they were giving out to the community wasn't bioavailable. It turned out that actually it was bioavailable, and it was leachable into the environment. Other ones we've had said to us before, the wind blows emissions away, i.e. there's no deposition, and it's not us, but it's the other company. Other ones. There are other sources, lead petrol, lead flashing, or you can't smell the emissions, or the children reading fishing sinkers, paint chips are affected by petrol, lead emissions, discarded batteries, etc., etc. And these are all statements that have been used in regard to matters that we've raised or dealt with previously. And then when you produce some really good data, i.e. produce some science or technical type arguments, what you usually get then is a different suite of responses, a bit more sophisticated. The emissions are below the required license standards, and that's the line of argument that the Glencore have used at Mount Isa. And the data that's been produced is not sufficient with our own data or studies. That against something that's been promulgated by Xstrata as it was. The data can't prove the emissions are the source of the problem, and that's a critical thing. What is the source of the problem? Industrial mineralisation is a minor component versus natural sources. Now, I don't know what the term, if anybody knows and can explain to me what industrial mineralisation is, I'd be really happy to hear that, because that's the first time I've ever seen that term, and that's a construct by industry. I think it really means contamination, but it's a really nice way, it's a very clever way of describing it. Then you've got the researcher used the wrong methods, misinterpreted the data, and the study was not consistent with the NEPA when in fact that it was, and Rachel down here will know about that one, that's a special one for her. So there are all these reasons why we can trot out that we don't have to do anything. We can just kind of ignore the study, there's not a problem, and it'll go away. If that doesn't work, and it carries on, the attacks get personal. Mr. Taylor's a left-wing greenie trying to shut down mining. The researcher must be in hospital-like conditions. This gentleman has a history of writing such reports, and this was levelled at Paul and I. The report is by Interstate Scientists. That came out of Tasmania. So sorry if everybody's from Tasmania, but there's no surprises by that. So it doesn't matter what you do. There's a whole raft of wonderful and colourful terms and phrases that are used to sort of denigrate or downplay the research. And all of the things that I've shown you on the previous one, these are all things that we had said to us or written to us or written about us. It's absolutely blame anything but the obvious, and if all else fails, attack the scientists. But once they're getting stuck into you, that's a good thing, because they're not talking about the data. And you always say, let's look at the data. What does the data say? What does it show us? What should we do about it? Once the attacks get personal, they want to derail the discussion about the actual facts. And this is another one, especially for my friends who are sat 2 or 3 seats back. It's the regulators, hundreds and thousands of excuses. I've shown this slide before, and I have to explain to people overseas that I think we all know what those little sweet things are on the biscuits. There's hundreds and thousands. My kids go mad for them, and they go mad when they've had them. And so the hundreds of excuses, this. There are many hundreds of pollution issues that EPA is involved in every year. There are hundreds of emerging issues in environmental health. Collecting the relevant environmental data costs hundreds of thousands of dollars well outside the EPA budget capacity. And all of those things may be true. But this is these are excuses or reasons for not actually tackling the matter. And it may well be true that regulators are not actually, and I'll say this to be fair to the EPA, partly because they're here today, but also because it's true, that they're not charged. They're charged with the polluter pays principle. And when you're dealing with legacy contamination, there is no polluter in order to pay for that cleanup. And that's one of the major problems, and that's another issue that we can talk about later. But all of these things require money or investment or time or skill or ingenuity in order to unwrap the problem, in order for us to move forward. So basically, you could sum up the legacy contamination problem. Scientists deny it, identify it, sorry, industry deny it, and regulators like to avoid it because it can be pretty difficult to deal with. So I'll move to one of my most favourite mining town here in Australia, and I actually really love this place. I've been there a lot of times, and I'm looking forward to going back many more times. Broken Hill, been going for more than 130 years. It's Australia's longest surviving lead-zinc silver mine, and it's produced thousands of jobs, but it's also had an impact on the adjoining urban environment, which we're working on now with the Broken Hill Environmental Lead Programme. But the history there at Broken Hill has somewhat coloured people's perspectives. And in a report for the EPA in 1993, it said Broken Hill has few similarities with other mining and even smelting communities. In fact, it appears closer to communities where intensive traffic movements and or paint have been identified as prime sources of lead. That basically means it's not the mining isn't the cause of the problem. And this picture here, this is a picture of Carillion. Who's been to Broken Hill? Okay, I've been all of it, yeah, of course. And this is here. This is what we call the cone of lead and zinc ore. And this is where the ore comes to the surface on this conveyor belt, and it's dropped onto the surface. And I'm going to show you a video of this shortly. My understanding is that this cone of lead is now under a pollution reduction program, and the emissions from that cone of lead are being addressed. And you'll see some of these emissions as we go through. But nevertheless, this report by Woodward-Clyde in '93 said the primary source of the lead is the ore body, arising from erosion of the surface due to geological processes and mining and mineral processing activities over the past 100 years. The point here is that primacy is given to the naturally occurring weathering processes, not the mining operations. So, is there a problem in Broken Hill? Well, here's a graphic showing blood lead levels of Broken Hill children in the recent period. I haven't got 2015 data here, but this is based on the old standard of 10 micrograms per deciliter. And you can see in 2012 to 2014, kids who had a blood lead level above the then acceptable value of 10 micrograms was in the order of about 20% of children. The level is now 5, and that means basically about 50% of the kids exceed the acceptable level. Now, 5 micrograms per deciliter, if you read the international literature, is at the level where people start to become concerned, more definitively concerned, that there's likely to be harm, and that harm could be impacts on IQ, behavioural impacts, ADHD, oppositional defiant behaviours, along with other physical and biological impacts, such as reduced delayed maturation, for example. And so there's a real problem here. There's a genuine environmental health problem identifiable in markers in children. But the problem is, while the arguments surrounding the issue of source remain, there can be no effective cleanup. And that's when scientists come in order to unpick it using careful forensic studies. So I'll show you. So just a brief background, the picture on the top left, that's what the original outcrop looked like, and on the bottom right, that's what the outcrop looks like now. That thing in the middle at the top, that's the restaurant, which is now closed, and the item to this building here to the far left is a memorial to the miners. Anybody who goes to Broken Hill, go and have a look at that memorial if you haven't seen it. It's just horrendous when you read it's just horrendous, the deaths that people suffered. And it actually is quite sobering to sort of see how people live their lives. And another sobering thing to do is, if you go to Broken Hill, is to go to the graveyard. It sounds a bit morbid, but you can see the difference in the lifespan between couples, men and women. Men typically died in their 40s and their 50s, and often it was two brothers, and the men in the family died, and the women would live till they were 70, 80. And the consequences of industrial harm and death is quite significant. It's very interesting just walking around the graveyard. So just a very simple summary of the geology in Broken Hill. It's a boomerang shape. The primary ore body used to outcrop at the surface. We're now mining only in the southern end of the line of load. It's called the line of load. Apparently the north end is going to be reactivated, I understand, but the outcrop used to be here. The surface expression was weathered, a weathered deposit was a gossen, and the primary minerals were at about a couple of 100 meters depth below the surface, containing silver, lead, zinc, etc. This is an old geology map. Can't remember off the top of my head the era. I think it's about 1900. But what it shows you quite nicely is in this darker colour here, where the arrow is, that's the actual ore body. And the point of view, and if you look underneath, this is the ore body. And the point of me showing this is that it's a very linear feature. It's not dispersed throughout the landscape, so it's got a very defined source. And so the concept of the lead in and around Broken Hill being sourced from this very single fine source is quite a difficult one, because that would have to weather and then be dispersed throughout the local environment. But let's look at some of the data that unpicks that story. So we did some soil sampling here. This is rather piffling soil sampling numbers compared to I think something like 20,000 samples that Pirelli have collected and Plasminco over time using XRF. But these samples show quite clearly on the left-hand side, which is lead. This is from our study. You can see as you move closer to the mining operations in the middle, the concentrations get higher. The same pattern arises with zinc. Then we were fortunate to find in the 1893 inquiry into lead poisoning in Broken Hill, there's a soil lead map in the back. I think it's the oldest soil lead map that exists in Australia, and it's really useful. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see I've highlighted there's these points on that map, and you can't see, but in the description at the bottom of the map it says, when it relates to these sites with no soil lead. So we back calculated what the analytical limits were of those days. It was about 80 milligrams per kilogram. So we're assuming that when they said there was no soil lead, it was less than 80 milligrams per kilogram in 1893. We went back to those sites as best as we could locate them using the map and GPS, and we collected soil samples at the surface and at depth, and we've shown you just the zinc and the lead on the right-hand side. And what you can see there is the concentrations are greatest in the upper part of the soil profile, and they decline very rapidly in all of the holes with both lead and zinc. Now, I put it to you, if the contamination in and around Broken Hill was naturally occurring, you would expect an ore body that was 1.6 billion years of age to be shedding lead and zinc and other elements into the soil, and would have a more or less even distribution of contaminants through the profile. The very fact that they're captured in the upper part of the soil profile indicates a deposition which is one, recent, and two, atmospheric. Soil profiles around the city, and they basically showed exactly the same thing. The contaminants were predominantly held in the 0 to 2 or the maximum 0 to 10 centimetre part of the profile, predominantly 0 to 2 part of the profile. And this term here, SER, is the surface enrichment. That's just the ratio of lead in the surface versus that at depth. And you can see the significant surface enrichment. Anything over 1 shows that the surface is enriched. We undertook some lead isotopic composition analysis, and what we were able to show is that predominantly surface soils, the black dots here, that's the calculation of the ore body, it's measurement of the ore body. What we can see predominantly as surface soils are very similar to the ore body, whereas soils at depth, which are these captured by the circle on the right hand side, they don't look like the ore body. So that tells us that the deep old soils have a different isotopic composition, a different origin, whereas the upper parts of the soil profile look just like the ore body, which is consistent with a recent deposition mechanism. And then with some other data that I think we're about to get it accepted in the journal Atmospheric Environment with one of my other students, Chen In Dong. We've collected some surface dust samples and we've looked at the isotopic composition of those. Actually got them from dust gauges, and you can see this is the ore body, and these are some of the surface dust samples. They are very similar. I think we're in about 90% of the ore body. There's still other sources obviously floating around the town, but they're predominantly the same as the ore body in Broken Hill, telling us that even contemporary deposits, contemporary dust deposits, are being derived from the operations. We undertook a study a couple of years ago, and this actually is what led it helped drive the new $30 million program which Broken Hill has now, which has been run by the New South Wales EPA to try and fix the lead exposure problems in kids. We did a study in playgrounds. We had a play routine where we played on the play. We did hand wipes before we played on the playground. We did a fixed routine for 10 minutes, and then we did hand wipes afterwards, the same set routine on the hand wipes, and we're able to compare the pre and post lead on the hands after playing on the playground. The black dots mark the pre-play, and the bars mark the blue bars, mark the post-play lead concentration. So it's lead on the y-axis, and the days at each of these. These are just two playgrounds here, and you've just got different days on each of the playgrounds. So you can see that even though the playgrounds have been played on, it appears that there's significant daily deposition on those playgrounds. The red line is I won't go back. I've been told not to go back. The red line on those graphs marks the lead deposition concentrations, lead loading, so I should say that's acceptable for surfaces acceptable by children. And I happen to be here in 2015, and I captured this video of the cone of lead, as we love to call it at work. And I just want to share this little clip with you, if it works. Cassify. Doesn't work. That's very disappointing because it is a great video. But it works on my Mac. So what this video shows is the dust blowing up over the cone, entraining the dust and blowing it off into the surrounding environment. I can supply it to people if they want to see it. It'll be in our atmospheric environment paper. It worked this morning because it's gone from Windows to Apple to Windows. So moving on. If you don't believe any of that, you can go and mine the ASX data, and then also mine the New South Wales blood lead data. And we haven't published this yet, so don't nobody steal it, please. So what you can see here is the blue line is the lead that is reported to the stock exchange that was produced by the mine in a particular year, plotted by the blood lead in that particular year. And there's an uncanny correlation. Now it's not causation, but there's an uncanny correlation. And we also looked at the percentage of lead produced, and it's similar but not quite as good. But it draws us to this additional piece of evidence to suggest that the mining operations are quite significant in causing the problem in Broken Hill, and they're the issue that needs to be dealt with. So that's Broken Hill. I want to work on to my next favourite mining and smelting location, which is Mount Isa, and that's where I cut my teeth in this sort of forensic environmental science. The same sort of story pertains up there. In an extra media release in 2007, they said Mount Isa lies in a highly mineralised area. Lead occurs naturally within local soils across the region. Therefore, it must be acknowledged that lead is a naturally occurring substance in the local area. Sounds really good and really convincing. Of course it's naturally occurring, because they wouldn't be mining it there. But logic would have it, if the town was riddled with mineable lead, they'd be mining in the town, wouldn't have people living there. The miners aren't stupid. They know where this stuff is. And so the mine is really, you'll see in a minute, I'll show you a figure, it's really on a specific location where the dust. So I mined some government data, and this is lead in air data from the centre of Mount Isa, and it shows you over 3 years the distribution of lead throughout the year. So the main thing I wanted to look at here is not particularly the numbers, but you can see there's a seasonal pattern. You can see in the summer period the levels of lead in air are greater than the winter. Would you concur with that? Now, there's nothing natural about that, because if it was natural, it would all have the same number throughout the year. It would all be more or less the same. What you probably don't know is that the wind blows from the mine site north on the other side of the mine site across town in the summer period for about 20% of the year, and in the winter period it blows from the desert from a southeast direction across the town, across the mine, and then away. It does blow the emissions away in that period, but there are periods of time, about 20% of the year, when it blows it across town, and you can see that when you just look at lead in air concentrations. And then we also did a similar study. We did this before the Broken Hill stuff. We looked at surface lead concentrations and those with depth in copper and lead and zinc. And you can see there's a big copper mine up there as well. And you can see with both copper and lead, there's a very similar pattern that we saw in Broken Hill. The concentrations are highest in the surface and they fall off with depth. Interestingly, what you can see as well, some of these, without going into detail, the concentrations in the top of the surface profiles are actually greater than what they are recorded. And this figure that I've got in the middle here, this is taken from a publication by Mount Isa mine geologists, where they showed what the concentration of the lead was in the surface rocks. And you can see here it was 125 parts per million on the outer edge of the ore body, which is here. But in surface deposition out of town, the brown is the urban area. You can see you have lead concentrations of nearly just under 400 parts per million. It's incongruous with the naturally occurring concentrations. And then we did the isotopes. Isotopes are wonderful, particularly when you've got a clear source. In the bottom left-hand corner, we've got the Mount Isa ore body, which has actually got a very similar fingerprint to that of the Broken Hill ore body. It's the same sort of age, known as Broken Hill type ores. And what you've got here, excuse me, the diamonds, the circles, and the red triangles. These are all contemporary or surface soil deposits that we collected at Mount Isa. And the other point to look at are these open triangles, which are soils at about 10 to 20 centimetres depth. The soils at 10 to 20 centimetres depth look nothing like the ore body, but all the surface samples look remarkably like the ore body, which leads us to the conclusion that contamination in and around the environment in Mount Isa is directly related to that of the ore body, and the same pattern pertains, i.e. the surface soils look just like the ore body at those at depth. It's the same conclusion we draw at Broken Hill. That can only have occurred through fairly recent deposition to the environment. And then I haven't done a whole proper GIS overlay here, but if you compare on the left-hand side, you have the Mount Isa Mines Geology map, which was produced in the Mount Isa Lead Report 2008, and you compare it to blood leads on the right-hand side. If the argument is that kids are only getting leaded through naturally occurring lead in the soils, you would get only kids with elevated blood leads located immediately adjacent or on top of locations where the lead occurs in and around the city, which it does in a few places. But you don't. What you get is kids' blood leading. This is the darker dots. It's quite hard to see here. These are the darker dots scattered all over the town, which doesn't fit with the expression of lead in rock, which is typically over a very limited geographic space. If all that's wrong, you don't believe me, you can just take a photograph and the pollution is blowing across town. Because here is a fence. On the left-hand side of that fence is the mine, on the right-hand side is the city, and here you can see this is the copper stack blowing emissions across the town. So it's not as if the emissions don't get blown across town. There is strong resistance to research asking these sorts of questions, and this led to the Mount Isa Mayor John Maloney commenting on a piece of work we did in 2010. He said, "We're a great town, we're a working town, a great town," and the bloke who wrote that must be working in hospital-like conditions in a big city. He wouldn't understand life out here. I have spent some interesting times in grotty caravans in the outskirts of Mount Isa. I understand Mount Isa, so that was a bit unreasonable. Anyway, the long and short of all of that is that in 2017, Glencore finally got over its industrial constipation and released its report, which has been in the making for 11 years and was about 5 years overdue. They produced the most critical part of their lead pathway study, which was the air report. And the air report essentially said this, if I was to boil it down: the contamination and the exposure to kids is occurring from fallout, but their emissions are below the licence limits. And residents were told to remove carpets and keep their homes clean in order to protect the kids from getting leaded. The subtext is they cost up and they admitted the fact that their emissions are causing contamination, and it's not naturally occurring. They did a whole lot of bioavailable and bioaccessible studies, and it was quite clear. The story is obviously a bit more complicated than that, but it's good. Now we've got over this hurdle of denial, the source and cause of the problem is known and can be addressed. And I do believe they're attempting to do that to some degree. It's not as good, though, I will say, as Broken Hill or Port Pirie, where there are systematic programs in those communities. And I had a phone call from ABC about this the other day. He'd been up to Mount Isa, and he was looking at the program that they've got in Mount Isa to address kids' blood lead problems, and it's quite ad hoc, very different in New South Wales and South Australia. That's in itself is quite interesting. So if you get the evidence right, you can get some really good outcomes, and that's the most important thing. It's not about who's right or who's wrong, it's about moving forward. So there's been more than $1 billion have been invested in improved environmental outcomes and human health programs, consequent on some of the research that we've done. Most of that investment wouldn't have occurred. Most of that investment occurred in Australia, on improving Australian conditions, employing Australian people. So this shows that actually research is good for the community, it's good for the environment. It counteracts to some degree criticisms by the Port Pirie mayor at the time, Mr. Brenton, who said, "What's Professor Taylor contributing to the economy? This smelter contributes $1.6 billion a year." So Port Pirie, they're going to get a new smelter, cleaner smelter, multi-metal smelter, $500 million. More than $600 million will be spent on environmental improvements at Mount Isa, and blood leads have started to fall. And Broken Hill, the New South Wales government, have invested $13 million in a new program to help make sure that kids don't have elevated blood leads. These are really great outcomes from research. So my sort of message when I give this talk is that you can't deny independent facts. It's all about the facts. Get the facts right, stack them up. And we're fortunate in the position of at universities of not really being beholden to other people who may not want you to release that information or do that study. We can go and do studies wherever we see fit and then share that information, make sure it's rigorous, it's well constructed, conducted by the best laboratories. But the absence of evidence or industrial denials is an opportunity, and that's what all my students see. And Paul Harvey, our new chair, saw a great opportunity in Tasmania when GHD claimed that the water in the town northwest town called Pioneer was contaminated by naturally occurring sources and catchment, and he just said, "It's just a beauty, we've got to go and sort that out." And sure enough, he did a great job. So robust, independent geochemical data can challenge the status quo and stimulate really good, effective regulatory action. Finally, I suppose, expect some bruises, but take them as badges of honour, because people love throwing pies at you, but that's just part of the game. It's just the game. Finally, it's not natural stupid. And this slide here on the right is from Gary Larson, and I had this mug for years, and it never registered with me. But Midvale is a lead town in the States. I just didn't realise, and my friend and colleague Bruce Lanfear done some work there, and it's just perfectly captured it. So if you collect the right environmental, geochemical, historical information, etc., you can show that natural processes are largely relevant in terms of contamination of these mining and smelting towns. And this led us to conclude in our paper, with Louise, that the miner's myth is tantamount to a load of lies. Breaking the myth with sound evidence is essential for stimulating cleanup and changing the status quo and moving us forward with evidence-based information.